Hello, everybody, and welcome to a Arsenal Pass Deck Tech. I'm joined by none other than HowlingMines, someone we've been waiting to have on the channel. My first introduction to HowlingMines here was actually his long-form video of Icelander, when he performed well with Icelander. I did watch that entire thing from my hotel room in Prague shortly after PT Lille, but you're back with another spicy deck. It's funny for me to say spicy deck because people think about Icelander now. It's not that spicy, but when you played it, it definitely was in the PT Lille kind of meta. But you're back again with Dromai, Iris of Reality. You're a well-accomplished player. In case people don't know, you've been playing since Arcane Rising. Battle hardened top 4 on Lexi, top 100 worlds, 13 out of 507 in Icelander in the Calling Lil, which is the reason that I watched that video. I think you did the best out of any Icelander there. And then top 4 in the 163 player PQ recently in Leeds with Iris Dromai. So why don't you just give us the 10,000 foot sort of view of what is Iris Dromai and where the heck did it come from?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much. It's kind of really surreal to hear that people watched that video that I obviously didn't know at the time, and like it meant so much and did so much for them. It's very, very cool. But Iris Dromai was very much a pet project for me. So I love Dromai as a hero. I think the idea of attacking with dragons is really cool. So naturally, I'm doing none of that. Had a lot of experience with the deck beforehand. I think it's really fun, but I found its matchups are obviously like super polarizing. Typical illusionist problem, same problem that Prism already had. So my original goal with this was to try and build a Dromai list that didn't lose any of the good matchups Dromai traditionally has, but is better into the matchups where it is horrible. So instead of maybe winning 1 out of 10 times, we win 3 or 4 out of 10 times. I think this deck still has a lot of room to evolve, this kind of version. I know a few people are trying like the red line versions to try and fix the same kind of problem. But that was very much the key. So what ended up happening instead, we ended up with a deck that is arguably better into the mid-range aggro decks, is still absolutely terrible against Fi, but basically cannot lose against Oldham and Icelander.
Yeah, and I think with Fi, it looks like it's seen a bit of a drop off, at least in this PQ sort of weekend one. I will see once Flesh and Blood releases the data. The meta tends to converge around that data as well. But it seems like Oldham is going to be a top pick, so we might see a lot of players shift over to that as well, which makes Dromai an even better pick. Dromai is an interesting hero because it came out in Uprising. It didn't see a lot of success, and I mean, I would argue it really hasn't seen a lot of success outside of Worlds, putting one player in the top 8. But usually seen as the deck that just automatically folds to Fi, right? And if we're in a Fi dominated meta, people really avoided it. But it didn't just lose to Fi, right? It lost to other decks. It wasn't as good as Prism into the Guardians, at least in its previous build. So it looks like you've solved that issue, which definitely is going to make it attractive for all those Prism players that have just been searching for their souls since that living legend. So what are the
I have found the deck for them for sure.
what are the strengths and the weaknesses of this hero in particular, at least in this meta?
So I think this list of Dromai is very much a dedicated meta call. For me, we played this on the Sunday after the Battle Hardened, where the top 8 of the Battle Hardened was just 5 Icelander and 3 Oldhim. So it was like the perfect time for me to go, right, bring out the deck that doesn't care about Fi and go. And that's kind of where we were. So the kind of power of Dromai as a hero, arguably, is at the moment you have the old dash problem where people don't really know what you're going to be turning over, what you intend to present, because people are trying to pull around, the more Darkodius style dragon decks we've seen having PQ success. We've seen these red hot aggro decks from people like DMR. People really aren't sure if you're going to be trying to come for them and try and take them out and race them, or whether you intend on playing this long attrition game. So we can use that to our advantage and take this third axis by kind of ignoring a lot of the cards that people are playing for those two matchups and making them mostly redundant. Our opponents will wear Null Rune into us to protect from Asvalai and burn them all, and we can't do any arcane damage. We find ourselves in spots where people assume Icelander can race you because your deck is full of reds. Bam, we have 34 blues. And I think that's largely the most underexplored part of Dromai, is that you can build a of ways so that no one really knows what you intend on doing before you turn your equipment over.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, with that, we're going to throw the deck list up on screen. Actually, just get right into it. All right, Howling Minds, here is the deck. Why don't you just talk about sort of the core function of the deck? What are you trying to do game to game? What is the specific game plan that is trying to execute that makes it powerful?
Okay. So this version of Dromai has two distinct game plans that you will choose one to move towards depending on what you are playing against. Your primary game plan in the majority of matchups is to establish auras in a style similar to Prism used to. You're going to look to play out these blue auras whenever you get the ability to, either choosing to block with 3 cards and play one, or attack with the ones that are already in play, play another, and then try and efficiently block with the rest of your hand through cards like Sand Cover, Oasis Respite, efficient block 3s and defense reactions. This kind of means that you reach this end game where every card in your deck is worth 4 damage as a blue, which is essentially a pile of Winter's Whales, which is a really good control end game, because your all blue hand can just present 16 once you have access to 4 auras in play. In the matchups that are much faster and that are going to be aggressive towards you, dashes, the Fies, this kind of stuff, we actually try and become a bad Icelander in a way, because we have so many blues that we can actually just play efficient 2-card attacks. Basically every turn we can use 2 cards to kind of keep ourselves safe and defend, and then try and send a large attack like a Fiendl's Fighting Spirit, a Miraging Metamorph, a Phantasmal Haze, or sometimes even like an Enlightened Strike plus another big red attack, and just race our opponents, because we know the long game is not going to work in that capacity. They're going to get to us first, so if we can just present more damage than them on every turn cycle, that's how we try and win those matchups.
Mm-hmm. So against the aggro decks, you're playing out these bigger attacks. You're sort of racing them down, not letting them drag you into sort of their territory, their game plan. And against the control decks, so the slower decks like Icelander and Oldhim, you're utilizing these auras, utilizing Iris of Reality, and basically swinging, like you said, multiple Winter Whales per turn. So can you quickly go over some of the combinations and key cards and interactions and how they work together?
Sure. So there are a few cards that I think are really worth paying attention to in this kind of deck, and I guess the highlights of it. The first one I'm going to talk about is Burn Them All. Everyone looks at me like I'm mad when I tell them this is one of the red 15 red deck, but it's actually just secretly the win con of the deck in nearly every matchup, because you finally have an aura that not only has Go Again, not only blocks 3, but your opponent cannot attack it, and they do not decide when they get to remove it. As a result, you find you're winning a lot of games from Burn Them All gaining counters from Shimmers of Silver, because they can't take it off the board. So you're just suddenly attacking for 5, then attacking for 6, then attacking for 7, which kind of forces the issue on them having to remove Shimmers, giving you a whole hand to attack with the rest of your auras instead. Burn Them All also plays exceptionally well with Haze Bending, because paying for Burn Them All is optional. You don't have to remove reds if you're light on them or you want to save them for another Burn Them All down the line. You can just let Burn Them All die and make a shield on the way out. You'll find that the best 1-card hand that is available in Flesh and Blood is also in this deck, with just a Tunic Resource and a Miraging Metamorph. Obviously, pushing 7 off of 1 card is an absurd rate. And it obviously just plays very well with all the auras you're already looking to play. And then we have a few more packages built into this deck that are worth paying attention to. So Brothers in Arms Blue is a card that's kind of thrived in Icelander recently. Sees a lot of play in Oldhim as well. We use it by turning our block 2s into a block 3, by pairing it with Fantastic Steps or cards like Oasis Respite to kind of utilize those spare resources and still block 4 with a blue when we want to keep our blue count fresh and high. Phantasmal Haze, also a card that kind of thrives in this deck as well, because Phantasmal Footsteps lets you attack with the shield afterwards should they choose to prop it. Last but not least, I got Wave of Reality. It's actually a Dynasty card basically no one was talking about in Dromai or in Illusionist whatsoever. And I actually think this card is secretly kind of cracked in exactly this deck. Maybe not Dromai overall, but in the Iris archetype, because it's essentially an arm piece that blocks 2 that has a Scar for a Scar attached. So if you leak a damage on turn 0 and let the armor break, you will have a weapon to pressure your opponent with immediately, which is something no other card in the deck can do.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk a little bit more about macro game plans and sort of what this is doing into some matchups, right? So are you trying to take damage sometimes? Are you trying to land a specific number of auras, right? Is there a critical maximum? You're like, okay, my game plan kind of switches here. And how much does this deck block?
Not quite a lot with this deck. You'll find the early game, you will often be on the back foot. Most classes realize they are the aggressor against you, even if they're Oldhim or Bravo or similar. So taking damage to establish your important auras, your Shimmers, your Haze Bendings, that's completely fine. You don't mind taking damage and losing those turn cycles to get them in place. Or you can kind of look to, run out, burn them all once you've filtered some reds. So you'll find a lot of the early game, you'll be blocking with your defense reactions, your Oasis Respites, your block threes, red attacks in matchups where you don't care about swinging them. And then you can just get on the table and start filtering through those reds pretty early, if that's how the matchup tends to play out. In terms of critical mass for auras, one of the biggest ways you can actually lose games with this deck is by overextending on auras. You don't need to have 7 auras, 8 auras, 9 auras in play. You earn the respect of your opponent having to clear them once you kind of get to that 2 or 3 mark. 4 is the golden number in an ideal world because it turns a 4 blue hand into 16 damage, which is incredible. But 2-3 is where you'll find yourself the majority of the time. At that point, you're probably better off pitching the blue aura to attack for another 4 damage as opposed to playing it out, because you already have the lead on board as things stand anyway. You'll find most matchups kind of find yourself in this kind of lock of sorts towards the end when you've got too many auras in play. Your opponent can really no longer pressure them without leaving 3 or 4 in play still, and pressure you without still taking 2 Winter's Wail hits on the way back. The aggro matchups are definitely the alternative, and things go the other way. It's okay to block aggressively and filter through your deck very, very quickly. Just block with all 4 cards and keep drawing until you find those attacks. The big red attacks, things like Fighting Spirit, Metamorph, Phantasmaclasm, this kind of stuff. But you should basically be trying not to block with those ever, because you need to keep them for 2 card hands to actually win those games.
Absolutely. So we do have a split between a core deck and a sideboard. Talk to me a little bit about the core. Tell me about the ratios and why it's these 48 cards specifically.
Sure. So I always try and find myself with decks that I build that don't have random 1-ofs or 2-ofs to give myself a round number to board up to. So 48 cards which means it's 4 play sets of cards to fix the matchup that I'm playing against, which makes sideboarding nice and easy and nice and concise. The magic on this deck really is finding the perfect balance of blues to reds. The deck is obviously very blue hungry because you're paying to attack with auras with a blue, but you need enough reds in the deck to not only be able to pressure the aggro opponents, but also pay for burn them all and keep it around in the matchups where you want it to be around for 4 or 5 turns. So really important to kind of hit this balance. As a result, the core is 15 reds and 33 blues. And you'll find that most of the time we bring in another 3 to 5 blues depending on the matchup and shore up the rest with reds. So it tends to end up being about 24 reds to 36 blues when sideboarding is complete. As a result, all of your reds are kind of your power cards, because a red has to be really good to earn its slot in the core. 12 of those are just kind of the biggest, most efficient attacks the deck can play off of a single blue. So we're looking to Enlightened Strike for 7 if we're not going wide, off of a 2-card hand. Flying Spirit for 8, off of a 2-card hand. Metamorph 7, 2-card hand. Phantasmal Haze, same thing. These are just very much Wounded Bull style effects. We've seen how good they can be in the current metagame, and we just get the upside of playing some of the bigger illusionist ones as well. And that means the last 3 reds have to be saved for Burn Them All, because you need it as your endgame alongside Shimmers of Silver in those longer games, which is kind of where all the reds come from. And then the blues are very much your auras, blue block 3s that occasionally have upside and defensive tools, basically.
Yeah. And so have you done the math sort of? I mean, this deck looks like it's very important to have a blue in hand every single turn. It's probably how you came to this number. What is the have you done the geometric calculation on how likely it is to sort of have that blue every single time? How often are you running into non-functional hands with this deck?
Not very often at all, because most of the time you're pretty happy to filter through blues. You really don't mind. Your deck is built to accommodate for that. If your hand contains multiple reds, for the most part, so you have a 1% chance in the core of drawing an all red hand, and even some of those are playable just because Enlightened Strike exists, or Sink Below lets you block, or anything like this if you're playing those kind of matchups where Sink Below is coming in. But for the most part, if your hand contains just 1 blue and your hand isn't particularly functional in that regard, that means that these red attacks have to be in that hand. So you can afford to block with the spare reds and still have a good 2-card hand, even on a hand that doesn't really function.
So we've talked about our big attacks in the form of Fearless Fighting Spirit, Metamorph, Haze, and Enlightened Strike, as well as Burn Them All. As, like you said, one of the most important cards in the deck. Talk to me about the engine cards here. Talk to me about these blues, the auras, and what their function is, and kind of what they do specifically in the deck.
Sure. So, of course, we'll kind of bundle up the 12 blue auras together. These basically work as build your own weapons. They are your end game in these control matchups. They're always worth 4 damage each and every turn by attacking off of a blue from Iris of Reality. Shimmers of Silver and Haze Bending are easily the 2 most powerful ones, because they are just universally strong effects that every hero in the game kind of has to respect. Shimmers can't really be left alive, otherwise you're just winning every turn cycle. And Haze Bending always replaces itself and forces your opponent to attack it before they attack other auras, or they give you more shields to work with, which in this deck is just more 4-power attackers. That doesn't mean that Passing Mirage or Pierce Reality are bad cards, they're just more situational effects. You're mostly playing them as blue auras to attack with. The text isn't all that relevant. But Passing Mirage will come up against Guardians and stuff when you want to keep a Phantasmal Haze safe or something like this. And Pierce Reality is an effect you don't want to forget, but sometimes that's just attacking for 9 off of a Tunic resource from your Mirage. Just an otherworldly rate of damage overall. The other blues in this deck are all kind of carefully chosen for a number of minds. So we have Embermaw, Centipede, Coalescence Mirage, and the blue Phantasmal, the blues that will let you do your best Guardian impression when you have few auras in play, or you kind of have an all blue hand with no real reds to work with. It's most important that these all block 3 though, because you need to defend well with them the majority of the time should you not be attacking with them. So looking for blues that can attack in a pinch, the block 3, kind of the key in this spot. Coalescence Mirage is an interesting one, to be honest, because it does actually let you play 2 auras thanks to Phantasmal Footsteps sometimes, and its own destroy trigger off of being popped. Which is great. Embermaw kind of has this niche case of making Ash for sand cover on occasion, which is why it gets the nod over some of the other attacks. And that's kind of the same to be said for Slows. So Sweeping Blow, Dunebreaker, Centipede, and Spears of Surreality are all just the blues that we can play that have Go Again. So if we don't have auras in play and our hand is all blues, we can still do something with our cards, and not just have to block if we don't want to. Sweeping Blow kind of gets the nod because, again, making Ash for sand cover in some matchups is quite important. But for the most part, Dunes and Spears, they just block 3, they're blues, and they can allow your 4-card blue hand to do something if a lot of your auras aren't currently in play.
Awesome. Let's talk about this equipment. Not many options for you here. Kind of just got the bare minimum, it looks like.
Yeah, so we've got some sideboard choices in the outside of the core that we'll talk about in a bit, but this is kind of the setup that you play into nearly. You're wearing Tunic, Crown of Providence, Phantasmal Footsteps, Wave, and of course playing the Iris of Reality. Crown of Providence really shines in this deck. Not only do you want a piece that blocks, but you really don't use your arsenal all that much. Sometimes you'll get a blue stuck after you played an aura and had nothing to do with it. It's not very good, don't really want to play it. Sometimes you'll draw a sand cover and you've not had a way to make any Ash so far, so you can arsenal that and filter it away. It offers block, fixes that problem, which is kind of great. For the most part, your arsenal really isn't contested. If you have a card left in your hand, it's probably better off as being played as an aura or being 4 damage from an aura as a blue than being arsenaled. So you'll find it's empty quite a lot, makes Crown quite powerful at filtering. Tunic is becoming more and more of a staple in just about every hero going, to be honest, but it's very, very strong in this deck as well. It helps you beat Frostbites against decks that can make them against you, which is very important. But most importantly, it pays for Brothers in Arms sometimes, it pays for Oasis Respite sometimes, and it will pay for Phantasmal Footsteps in the more aggressive matchups literally all the time to stop those on-hit triggers from cards like Snatch, Mounting Anger, these kind of things in important spots, stop Mask of Momentum draws. And it's very, very good against Dash and their pistol as well. Kind of covers Footsteps in a roundabout way at the same time. But the Wave, we kind of talked about it briefly a minute ago, it's definitely M for this deck. Kind of a powerhouse piece of armor you play in most matchups where you don't want Null Rune. It basically blocks 2 damage over the course of the game, which is a good rate on an arm piece anyway, and give you that early aura on turn 0 to make your first turns of the game much stronger than they would be otherwise.
Awesome. Let's go ahead and head into the sideboard then. Just break down the cards for me.
Yeah, of course. So 27 cards in the sideboard total. We got some packages in here alongside some pieces of armor. Erase Face is mostly a nod to Dash. Aggro Dash can be a bit problematic for you if they know what you're doing. If they turn over Hyperdriver, Hanabi Blaster, Tekla Pounder, any of these kind of cards, you'll be completely fine. Just fatigue them out, block efficiently, you'll be okay. But if they turn over Induction Chamber and Pistol, the aggro deck can actually be quite hard for you. They're pretty happy to just send damage at your face and then pistol away an aura at the end of the turn. So we needed a dedicated tool to kind of take back tempo from them, to allow us time to establish auras or just threaten their life total with big attacks. Erase Face is the best one of those, thanks to being a very relevant line of text. Happens to have some splash damage against the Mirror Match and Viscerai as well. Prismatic Shield is possibly one of my most underplayed cards from Monarch. Never really saw success in Prism, to be honest. It's a really strong turn 0 play in this deck because suddenly, if your opponent passes after using their action point, you can just attack them for 12 on turn 0 with a pile of blues, which is something that no other card could ever let you do. But this is actually mainly here for a sweet little interaction in the Oldhim matchup because it lets you beat the Ice React. There's a lot of spots where you have a blue left in your hand. They want to Ice React you on your second attack for 4 with an aura to kind of stop another 4 coming in. You can then pitch the blue, make some shields, and just not have to draw the crappy blue again, which is very, very good and is also building a board for you at the same time. Oasis Respite. It's just a defensive tool. You're playing a lot of matchups where you're on the defensive, you're more of a control deck. It's obviously much better against the big Guardian attacks and arcane damage from decks like Icelander, from Kanos, this kind of stuff. Plays really well with Phantasmal Footsteps, Brothers in Arms, and your Tunic as a way to be able to pay for this efficiently and use other cards around it. This Rounds on Me is a card I just think is bananas. Stop printing good generics to block 3. It's definitely the best anti-aggro blue, in my opinion. It often prevents way more damage than the card you give to them over the course of a game, especially if you can play it off of a Tunic before you send in a big attack or start attacking with your auras. Sink Below here, just the best defense reaction in the game all round. It's in the deck in most matchups. It will often help you kind of filter your auras into too many auras in your hand. Or it can just kind of help you blocking with 1 or 2 cards and keeping those 2 cards like you want to over the course of a game. Phantasmaclasm is a card I was super excited to find when I was building this deck. I think it obviously saw some fringe play in Prism in the past, but playing it was sometimes hard. You found yourself kind of pitching a yellow, then pitching a blue so that the Phantasmaclasm had go again. We don't have to worry about that. We can just keep a 2-card hand, send 9 damage, which is obviously a fantastic rate overall. It is one of your best 2-card hands in the aggro decks, matchups, decks with no poppers, this kind of stuff. It can really help you break up Rune Blade's non-attack action, attack action balances to make their hand function. And it can do really niche things as well, like preventing big maximum velocity turns from Dash by kind of filtering through the chunk of cards that they would need to have that kind of turn. Sandcover, we've talked about it a few times. It's very much similar to Sink Below, Oasis Respite, just looking to prevent 4 damage for 1 card as often as possible. You'll often be making Ash with this one via your Footsteps, pitching a red, via paying for Metamorph, Sweeping Blow, Embermore Centipede. Sometimes you'll just overpitch a red to make an Ash if you've got a Sandcover available. And then last but not least, in terms of armor cards, we've got, non-armor cards, we've got the blue unmovables. These are ones that kind of drew weird looks from people all weekend. I found myself wanting a bigger defense reaction for matchups where I am the control deck, but I needed it to do something when I didn't want to use it, which is why we moved to the blue unmovable, because at the very worst, the card always pitches to attack with an aura if you don't want to use it as a defense reaction, and it covers all of the relevant crush triggers and stuff in matchups where those happen. The rest of your sideboard is very much your equipment pieces. They are AB3, for the most part. Crown of Reflection and Silent Stilettos are just Arcane Barrier. They don't really have much use outside of that, but you will occasionally Crown of Reflection break an aura when Haze Bending is in play to attack with another weapon, which is very cool. And then we have Mage Master Boots. Mage Master Boots, the last card in the board here. For matchups where you don't want Phantasmal Footsteps, you'll find, for example, turn 0, play 2 blue auras is as good as it was in Prism. That really hasn't changed. But you'll hold this a lot of the time to try and set up Haze Bending plus Shimmers of Silver in a matchup where your auras are constantly under pressure. Because it should be kind of hard for your opponent to ever clear the auras again if you can set those 2 up next to each other. So you'll find yourself pitch stacking them sometimes if they don't have the ability to come together. But that's kind of the 1-2 punch you're looking for with Mage Master Boots.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's start to round it out. What are the tips and tricks, right? What are the heuristics, things to remember? Sorry, it's just such a meme at this point when I say that word. But yeah, what are the heuristics and the tips and tricks of the stack?
Sure. So some basic kind of play pattern. We've kind of talked about play patterns in depth already. You're looking to be a control deck or to send 2-card hands. Tips and tricks to remember, the really big ones in my opinion. Burn 'em all will make a shield when it dies from Haze Bending. I know that doesn't sound like that big of a tip, but it comes up way more than you would think it does. Because sometimes it's correct to let the cards die so that you don't have to worry about an on-hit trigger in match how those come up. So if you're aware that your opponent's Phantasmaclasm or the way they played last turn, it can just really be correct to let the Burn Them All go to make the shield so that you only have to give 1 card to that attack and not have to worry about the extra point. Wave of Reality, if you're going second, try and leak 1 damage where you can so that you have a shield to attack with. Look to save your Tunic for those things that cost 1. And overall, Spectre is a pretty messed up keyword. It's always as good as it has been since Prism has been around. It will close the combat chain immediately. You want to keep that in mind when you're trying to figure out how you need to defend against things like rune chants and stuff like that. So just remember you're dealing with Spectra.
Mm-hmm. How do you utilize your arsenal? What cards do you prioritize arsenaling in this deck, and do you prioritize playing out 5-card hands versus playing out 4-card hands? Just talk to me about that arsenal slot during the game.
Yeah, sure. So the Arsenal, kind of as previously mentioned, is actually not very heavily contested in this deck whatsoever. You'll find that a lot of the cards in your hand left over towards the end of the turn are just worth more as 4 damage by attacking with an aura, or they are an aura you can play after you're done attacking. So a lot of this game plan kind of revolves around 2-card hands. We're very much a 2-card hand hero, where we're either keeping a blue and a big attack to send and not worrying about an Arsenal in that regard, or we're keeping blues and auras to start chaining off our Winter's Whale hits over the course of a game. For that reason, you can be pretty flexible with your arsenal. You're pretty happy to arsenal most things over the course of a game. Defense reactions are fine. Big red attacks are fine, so you can block with a card and still send a 2-card hand if you like. So yeah, don't worry about too much what's in your arsenal. It's mostly a pretty flexible zone. The only card you'll find yourself kind of regularly tucking in there sometimes is Burn Them All. If you end up in spots where you don't think it will come back to you, if you pitch stack it away, but you don't have enough reds in the graveyard yet to keep it alive for long enough, it will sit in the arsenal sometimes, but because it's such an uncontested zone, that's fine. You don't mind letting it sit there for 4, 5, 6 turns while you block with reds, attack with reds, and then it will finally have room to breathe shortly after that.
Mm. And how does the game plan change based on sort of your opponent's, I don't know, subjective value of your auras, right? If your opponent decides to not clear auras, is there a pretty clear game plan to win, and do you need to adjust it all when they do start aggressively clearing out your aura?
Yeah, you have flexibility in that regard. So if your opponent is pretty clearly choosing to ignore your auras and leaving 3 or 4 of them alive, coming at you, trying to end the game that way, the way you've got to think about it is all of your cards are worth 4, because if you've got enough auras in play to send all of your blues as 4 power attacks, blocking 3 damage means you are trading down and you're losing damage that you could be presenting instead. So don't feel free to block with random blues if you know that your auras are going to be alive. The game kind of goes the other way, though, where if they do want to clear auras, you'll often find yourself able to just kind of send a big red attack and have some blues left over. If they're aggressively clear auras, fine. Eventually, haze bending provides kind of bad exchanges for your opponent in that regard. You will always kind of have a shield left over on the turn they clear haze bending, start pressuring damage that way, and you can keep sending these big turns, these big reds, these Enlightened Strike plus attack turns, sometimes just E-Strike into another aura turns while your opponent keeps on clearing out your stuff. Because eventually, Burn Them All has to arrive, and Burn Them All is the aura that they cannot clear even if they want to. So if they're blocking out your reds and stopping themselves from dying, sending a weapon at an aura, this is good for you, because it's just getting closer and closer to these Burn Them Alls they cannot remove. And hopefully they'll have lost enough life to Burn Them Alls, kill them really quickly at that point.
Definitely. So how do you beat the deck? You talked about being a meta pick, right? So like the meta climate definitely does matter, right? If it was mono fi,
sure,
maybe not the best deck, but yeah, what's the deck's weakness? Is it purely just those go wide aggro decks?
Yeah, so go wide aggro is the big one. We have definitely made the Runeblade matchups better than traditional Dromai, in my opinion. When you don't have dragons to hit, Movrian Skies doesn't have a free way of triggering. We don't have all these free Mask of Momentum triggers that ninjas normally get. So you kind of get that advantage in those matchups. But the ninjas are still just horribly bad. Your game plan has to be soak up damage with 2 cards, send big red attack to have any kind of chance. But they are not matchups you should ever be expecting to win. If aggro dash knows to start pistol and chamber against you so that you can't just fatigue them out, that matchup can also be very difficult. It's very much the onus on them as to how many cards they play, how aggressively they boost, as to whether you have a shot to fatigue them or not. The pistol definitely starting to be scaled, clear auras way more easily, especially on high octane turns. Beyond that, decks that can kind of attack you multiple times and then clear an aura are the things you're going to be worried about. So if you're a Guardian player looking to have any kind of shot in this matchup, you want to load up on those Enlightened Strikes, those Zealous Beltings, those Out Muscles, these kind of cards, because they're the way that you're actually going to challenge this deck, because I can only do so much of defending myself and attacking you.
Yeah, very much classic illusionist right there. Lastly, what are some future changes you could potentially see in the deck list?
Yeah, so we've been working on this one for quite a while. It's very much been a passion project of mine since just before Dynasty released. So I think it's kind of hard at this point to say that the whole deck isn't just a meta call. Your matchups are very much going to be the reason to play this deck and or not, and with very much tailored for those matchups. The big one that I saw change-wise recently has been a Flamescale Furnace. I do feel like maybe it might give you a little more health to work with against Fi, against Aggro Dash, to be able to block with your chest and give up the Tunic instead. But I haven't found a space that I like, and it does make those Brothers in Arms effects significantly in those matchups, as it does make the Footsteps worse too. So not sold on it yet, still trying to find room to test it out. Beyond that, I think it's mostly the blue block threes that you have some flexibility in. I think you want the ones that can have go again in a pinch if your hand is a bit clogged up, or have like incidental bonuses, making some Ash for sand cover, this kind of stuff. But for the most part, as long as they're blue block threes, it doesn't really much matter what else they do the majority of the time. So I can definitely see us finding other attacks that fit that role, other cards that fit that role that kind of play into a metagame better. If we can find more effects like this round's on me that give you more game into Fi in the future, more generics that are just anti-aggro blues, those are going to be surefire inclusions in this deck, in my opinion.
Awesome. Well, HowlingMines, we really appreciate you finally coming on the channel, and hope to see more of you in the future. The deck list is in the description below, and if you do want to get the additional piece, the sideboard guide, along with a ton of written content, this time I think it was something around 2,500 words. HowlingMines has written.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah, he has written quite a guide for us. So down in the description below, there's also the Arsenal Pass Patreon. During this month, our $4 tier gets literally everything. So check that out if you're looking to pick this deck up and maybe, get the extra tips and tricks. It's honestly a great guide. I think it's the best one we've had done for us so far. But once again, HowlingMines, thank you so much, and I wish you the most success over the ProQuest season here, and hope to see you in Baltimore coming soon.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to seeing you there.